The sound was not one of anger, but of a world breaking. It was the crack of thick timber, the shriek of strained metal, and beneath it all, a bellow that was pure, undiluted agony. For a split second, the idyllic quiet of the valley held its breath, suspended between the gentle hum of a summer afternoon and the violence that was about to rip it apart. Marcus Thorne felt the ground shudder before he saw the source. Goliath, his prize bull, a creature of immense power he had raised from a wobbly-kneed calf, was no longer a familiar presence. He was a force of nature untethered, a storm of muscle and terror. His eyes, usually a deep, placid brown, were wild with a white-hot panic. He wasn't charging with purpose. He was exploding, a living bomb of fear and pain, and Marcus was standing at the epicenter. The fence post Marcus had been mending splintered into 1,000 pieces. Wood and wire cartwheeled through the air. Marcus barely had time to throw himself backward, landing hard on the packed earth, the air driven from his lungs in a painful gasp. Goliath thrashed, his massive head swinging low, not aiming for Marcus but for the phantom torment that had seized him. A horn, thick as a man's arm, sliced through the air inches from Marcus's face, a whisper of wind that carried the scent of dust and dread. Then, as quickly as it began, the rage subsided into a trembling, heaving monument of misery. Goliath stood panting, sides slick with sweat, his great body quivering, a low, guttural moan rumbling in his chest. The verdict was instantaneous, delivered on a wave of adrenaline and a town's collective gasp. A bull that turns is a bull that cannot be trusted. The unwritten law of the land was older than any statute, etched into the hearts of farmers who knew the razor-thin line between life and death. By nightfall, Goliath was no longer an animal. He was a liability, a monster. His fate was sealed in hushed, grim conversations over garden fences and in the dim light of the local tavern. He was to be put down at dawn. From a ridge overlooking the Thorne farm, a small figure had seen it all. Kai, a boy who lived on the periphery of the town's life, had watched the chaos unfold not with fear, but with a strange, piercing ache in his own chest. He saw what the others didn't. He saw the flicker of confusion before the explosion, the desperate bewilderment in the bull's eyes. He saw not a monster, but a prisoner screaming for release. As the sun bled out behind the mountains, casting long, mournful shadows across the valley, Kai knew a terrible injustice was gathering force, and the quietest voice in the valley would have to find a way to scream. Kai was a creature of the edges. He lived in a small, weathered shack with his grandmother, a place tucked into the crease of the hills where the manicured fields of the town gave way to wild scrubland. He was poor in the way that makes you invisible. His clothes were patched. His stomach often knew a dull, persistent emptiness, and his silence was mistaken for slowness. But Kai's world was anything but empty. It was rich with a language most people had long forgotten how to hear. He knew the irritable chatter of jays warning of a prowling fox, the contented sigh of cattle settling in for the night, the specific rustle of leaves that meant a deer was passing through. He didn't just see nature. He felt it as a current running through him, a deep, resonant hum that connected him to every living thing that couldn't speak in human words. This connection was his sanctuary and his secret. While other boys played games of conquest and noise, Kai would sit for hours, perfectly still, watching a spider weave its intricate universe, or observing the silent, patient politics of an ant colony. His grandmother, a woman whose own language was mostly one of weary sighs and gentle hands, understood. She knew her grandson possessed a kind of quiet magic, a deep well of empathy that flowed most freely toward the voiceless. He had a particular affinity for Goliath. From his perch on the hill, he had watched the bull grow from a curious, gangly calf into a magnificent, serene giant. He saw the gentleness in the way Goliath would allow smaller birds to perch on his broad back, the patience in his slow, meditative chewing of cud. But in the weeks leading up to the attack, Kai had noticed a change. It was subtle, a flicker in the placid brown eyes, a new tension in the set of his powerful shoulders. He saw a ripple of discomfort, a brief, sharp turn of the head, as if swatting at a persistent, unseen fly. he saw pain. It was a fleeting signal, easily missed by anyone not looking with their whole heart, but to Kai, it was a silent scream. The fence that separated the Thorn property from the wilder land was more than just wire and wood. It was a social divide. On one side was prosperity, order, and the loud certainty of people like Marcus Thorn. On the other was Kai's world of silence, observation, and poverty. He had never crossed it. It was a barrier he understood implicitly. But now, that fence represented an impossible chasm between a truth only he could feel and a tragedy that was about to unfold. The world had condemned Goliath based on a few seconds of terrifying violence, but Kai had witnessed the weeks of silent suffering that came before. He felt the bull's confusion, his fear, his agony, as if it were his own. The boy on the fringes was the sole keeper of the condemned bull's truth. The Thorn farmhouse was suffocating in a fog of fear and regret. Elara Thorn moved through its rooms like a ghost, the silence pressing in on her. She had not been there for the attack, but she had seen its aftermath in her husband's eyes. Marcus was a good man, a practical man, but his pragmatism had now hardened into a grim, unshakable resolve. For him, the equation was simple. Safety for his family trumped any affection for an animal, no matter how long, standing. But Elara's heart argued with a logic of its own. She remembered Goliath as a calf, clumsy and curious, with ears too big for his head. She remembered him following Marcus around the pasture like a shadow, nuzzling his hand for a scratch behind the ears. The monster her husband and the town described was a stranger to her. The creature she knew was incapable of unprovoked malice. That evening, she found Marcus on the porch, staring out at the empty paddock, his face a mask of stone. "It wasn't him, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the heavy air. "Not the Goliath we know. Something had to be wrong." Marcus didn't turn. His jaw tightened. "I was there, Elara. I saw his eyes. Another few inches. Another second. That's all that separated me from." He couldn't finish the sentence. The memory was too raw, too terrifying. "Fear makes you see monsters everywhere," she whispered, placing a hand on his rigid shoulder. What if he was just in pain? What if he was crying for help in the only way he knew how? Her words were a direct challenge to the reality he had constructed to protect himself from the horror of the moment. It was easier to believe Goliath had turned evil than to think he had failed to see an animal in agony. A short, sharp knock at the door broke the tension. It was Dr. Eris, the town veterinarian. He was a man of science and evidence, kind but unsentimental. He had performed a brief, post-attack check on the bull from a safe distance. "I'm sorry, Marcus. Elara," he said, his expression somber. "I looked him over. No visible injuries, no signs of sickness. Sometimes they just turn. A wire gets crossed in the brain. It's a tragedy, but it happens." Marcus nodded, his grim certainty validated by the expert. "See, Elara? There's no other explanation." But as Dr. Aris spoke, his gaze met Elara's, and he saw not acceptance, but a deep, unwavering conviction. Her plea hung in the air between them. "He was never vicious," she repeated, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Never." For a man like Aris, who dealt in facts, this emotional insistence was usually something to be managed, soothed, and ultimately dismissed. Yet, something in her certainty gave him pause. He had been rushed. The animal was agitated. The light was failing. Had he been as thorough as he could have been? A tiny seed of professional doubt was planted in the fertile ground of Elara's love for the animal. It wasn't enough to change the verdict, not yet. But it was a glimmer, a hairline fracture in the solid wall of condemnation. The final night settled over the valley like a shroud. The air grew cool and heavy, carrying with it a sense of grim finality. Dawn was no longer a promise of a new day, but a deadline. In the town, lights clicked off one by one, leaving behind a community that had resigned itself to the morning's grim task. For most, it was a necessary ugliness, the price of safety. For a few, like Elara Thorn, It was a sleepless vigil fueled by a feeling of profound wrongness. But for Kai, the approaching dawn was a personal torment. He lay on his thin pallet, but he was not in his small shack. He was in the holding pen with Goliath. He could feel the cold damp of the earth, the suffocating presence of the fences. He could feel the bull's confusion, a thick, rolling tide of bewilderment and fear. Goliath didn't understand the sudden shift from master's pride to menacing glares. He didn't understand the solitude, the absence of the familiar rhythm of the farm. All he knew was the lingering phantom of the pain that had driven him mad, and now a new, cold dread that radiated from the humans who watched him. Kai tossed and turned, the bull's quiet, shuddering breaths echoing in his own chest. He felt a desperate urge to communicate, to send a message across the distance. "You are not alone. I understand." This feeling was no longer a passive observation. It was a physical ache, a compelling force that pulled at him. It was the universe telling him that to stand by and do nothing was a betrayal of his very nature. His grandmother, sensing his distress, came to sit by his side. She placed a cool, wrinkled hand on his forehead. "Some things are too big to carry alone, little bird," she murmured. But Kai knew this was his burden to carry. He was the only one who had seen the truth, and silence was a form of consent. The decision solidified in his heart, not as a brave, heroic choice, but as a simple, undeniable necessity. He couldn't let Goliath die believing he was a monster. He couldn't let him die alone, surrounded by fear. He had to try, even if it was just to offer a moment of peace before the end, even if no one understood. As the first pale, ghostly light began to dilute the darkness in the east, Kai slipped out of his bed. He pulled on his worn boots, his small frame filled with a resolve that was far bigger than he was. He was going to cross the fence. He was going to step out from the edges and walk into the center of the storm. He didn't have a plan. He only had a whisper of a truth, and a desperate hope that it would be enough. The air at the Thorn farm was thick with a funereal stillness. A small group had gathered by the holding pen, their faces etched with a grim reluctance. Marcus stood apart, his shotgun held loosely, its cold weight a terrible punctuation mark on his failure. Dr. Eris was there, his face troubled, the seed of doubt Elora planted having sprouted into a thorny unease. A town official, a man named Henderson, was present to witness and legitimize the act. Goliath was a storm contained. He paced the enclosure, his hooves churning the dirt into a muddy soup. Every sound, a cough, a scuff of a boot, made him flinch, his massive head snapping up, eyes wide with animal terror. He was a cornered creature, radiating a palpable aura of fear that kept everyone at a careful distance. It was into this tableau of silent dread that Kai appeared. He didn't emerge from the road. He slipped through the trees at the edge of the property, a small, silent ghost materializing from the morning mist. He walked with a strange, calm purpose, his eyes fixed only on the bull. "Hey, kid, get back!" Henderson's voice was a sharp, angry crack in the quiet. Marcus turned, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Kai? What in God's name are you doing here? It's not safe." But Kai didn't seem to hear them. The world of human noise had faded into a distant buzz. All that existed for him was the terrified, magnificent creature in the pen. He unlatched the gate, the metallic click deafeningly loud, and slipped inside. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Marcus raised his gun not in threat, but in a panicked, protective instinct. "Kai, get out of there now!" The world seemed to hold its breath. Goliath stopped his pacing. He lowered his head, muscles bunching, a low growl of warning rumbling deep in his chest. He saw not a boy, but another threat, in a world that had become nothing but threats. But Kai did not flinch. He did not raise his hands in submission or defense. He simply walked forward, slowly, calmly, his small body a picture of impossible trust. He stopped a few feet from the bull's massive head, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to see the frantic pulse beating in his thick neck. And then he spoke. His voice was not a command, not a plea, but a whisper, soft as the rustle of leaves, yet it carried across the pen with absolute clarity. "It's okay," he breathed, the words a gentle current in the ocean of fear. I know you were hurting. It wasn't your fault." He took another step, reaching out a small, steady hand, not toward the bull's face, but lower, toward his chest. "You can let it go now. You're safe. I see you." The transformation was instantaneous. It was like watching a storm cloud dissipate in seconds. The tension drained out of Goliath's body in a great, shuddering sigh. The menacing growl softened, turning into a low, mournful moan. He lowered his head completely, the horns that were a deadly threat just moments ago now dipping toward the ground in a gesture of utter surrender. He nudged his vast forehead gently against Kai's small shoulder, and a deep, resonant sound, almost a purr, rumbled from his chest. He closed his eyes. In the face of pure, unconditional empathy, the monster had vanished, leaving only a tired, trusting animal who had finally been understood. The shotgun in Marcus Thorne's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a profane object in a sacred space. A profound, stunned silence descended upon the onlookers. The air, once crackling with tension, was now still and thick with disbelief. Henderson, the official, slowly, almost unconsciously, lowered the rifle until its barrel pointed at the earth. Marcus Thorne stared, his mouth slightly agape, the world he thought he knew completely reordered in the space of a single whisper. He had been ready to end a life based on the evidence of his own terror, and a small, poor boy had just disproven it with nothing more than quiet courage and a few soft words. The monster was gone. The threat had evaporated. What was left was an image so peaceful it was heartbreaking. A giant bull, the embodiment of lethal power, resting his head against a child, seeking comfort. It was Dr. Eris who broke the spell. The scientist in him, momentarily stunned by the miraculous, was now roaring back to life, fueled by a ferocious curiosity. The boy's whisper hadn't been magic. It had been a key. It had unlocked something, calming the animal enough to reveal a different possibility. All his training, all his experience, had been upended. He saw now that he had been examining a symptom, the rage, without ever being able to get close enough to find the cause. Kai hadn't healed the bull, not yet. He had created a space for healing to begin. "Don't move," Eris said, his voice hushed but authoritative. He spoke not to Kai, but to Marcus and Henderson. "Just stay still." He unlatched his medical bag with fumbling fingers, his mind racing. Hilara's words echoed in his head. Something had to be wrong. He had dismissed it as sentiment. Now he saw it as a diagnostic clue he had arrogantly ignored. He approached the pen slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, mirroring the boy's. Kai didn't move, his hand resting gently on Goliath's neck, murmuring soft, meaningless sounds that were pure reassurance. The bull remained utterly placid, his trust completely transferred to the small human who had met his fear with understanding instead of violence. "Let me look again, Marcus," Dr. Eris said, his eyes meeting the farmer's over the bull's broad back. "Let me do it properly this time." It wasn't just a request. It was an admission of fallibility, a plea for a second chance, not just for the bull, but for his own professional integrity. The immediate execution was no longer on the table. Kai's impossible act had bought Goliath not just a few more moments of life, but something far more valuable, the benefit of the doubt. The verdict, once so final, had begun to unravel. Dr. Eris worked with a gentle, focused intensity he hadn't been able to employ before. With Kai murmuring to Goliath, keeping him anchored in a sea of calm, the veterinarian could finally conduct the thorough examination the terrified animal had previously made impossible. He started with the bull's head, checking his eyes and ears, then moved slowly along his massive spine, his skilled hands probing for any sign of injury or inflammation. Everything seemed normal. Marcus watched, a knot of conflicting emotions tightening in his stomach: hope, dread, and a rising tide of shame. For a moment, he feared the doctor would find nothing. and he would be left to face the fact that he had almost killed a perfectly healthy animal whose only crime was a momentary, inexplicable break. But then Dr. Eris moved to Goliath's front left leg. As his fingers worked their way down toward the hoof, Goliath flinched. It was a small movement, a mere ripple of muscle under the thick hide, but in the profound stillness it was as loud as a shout. Kai instinctively gentled his whispering, his hand stroking the bull's neck with a steady rhythm. Dr. Eris paused, then probed the area again, more carefully this time. "Hold him steady, son," he murmured. He lifted the massive hoof, a feat that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. He cleaned away the caked mud and grime, and then he saw it. Tucked deep into the soft tissue of the frog, almost completely hidden, was a dark, jagged sliver of rusted metal. It was a shard from an old, discarded piece of farm equipment, and it had worked its way deep into the hoof, causing a festering, hidden infection. Every step Goliath took would have sent a jolt of pure, white-hot agony up his leg. He hadn't been charging Marcus in a psychotic rage. He had likely stumbled, putting weight on that hoof, and the excruciating pain had made him lash out blindly at the nearest thing. He wasn't a monster. He was a creature in unbearable, invisible torment. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Dr. Eris let out a long, slow breath, a sound of both discovery and regret. He looked up at Marcus, his face saying everything. "My God, Marcus," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The pain. It must have been unimaginable." Marcus stared at the ugly piece of metal in the veterinarian's hand, and the entire world tilted on its axis. The fear that had guided him, the anger, the certainty, it all dissolved, replaced by a wave of guilt so profound it made him physically sick. He hadn't been protecting his family from a monster. He had been about to execute a victim. His fear had made him deaf and blind to a cry for help that had been happening right in front of him for weeks. He looked from the wound to the boy, and finally to the bull, and for the first time he saw Goliath not as a threat or a commodity, but as the suffering creature he truly was. And he understood that the gravest danger on his farm that morning hadn't been the bull, but his own certainty. The healing began not with medicine, but with an apology. After Dr. Eris carefully and cleanly removed the metal shard and treated the deep infected wound, a palpable sense of relief settled over Goliath. The source of his torment was gone. He stood more easily, the tension in his frame replaced by a weary stillness. But the deeper wounds, the ones of fear and broken trust, remained. Marcus Thorne walked to the pen, his steps heavy with the weight of his new understanding. He dismissed the official, who left looking shaken and thoughtful. He sent Dr. Eris off with a quiet, grateful nod. He was alone now, with the boy and the bull, who had just dismantled his world. He stopped before Goliath, the fence no longer feeling like a barrier of protection, but a wall of his own making. He looked at the animal, truly looked at him, and saw the gentle creature he had known for years, now clouded by the memory of terror. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words feeling small and inadequate. His voice was raw. "I'm so sorry, Goliath. I didn't see. I was scared, and I didn't see." Kai, still standing by the bull's side, watched the man. He saw no pride, no anger, only a raw, humbling remorse. He gave Goliath a final, soft pat and slipped out of the pen, leaving the two of them to their silent reconciliation. The story spread through the valley, not like wildfire, but like the slow, steady light of dawn. It wasn't a sensational tale of a monster tamed, but a quieter, more profound story of a mistake almost made, of a truth revealed. Goliath, the condemned villain, became a symbol of misunderstood pain. Kai, the silent boy from the fringes, became the whisperer, a figure of quiet wisdom. The narrative of the town shifted. Fear gave way to introspection. People looked at their own animals, their own neighbors, with new eyes. Have you ever been so convinced of a story, so certain of your own judgment, that you couldn't see the truth even when it was right in front of you? Have you ever let fear write a narrative that compassion would have corrected, The town was asking itself these questions now. The healing was communal. The near tragedy had lanced a boil of fear and misunderstanding, and now a healthier, more empathetic current flowed through the community. The true miracle wasn't that a boy had calmed a bull, it was that he had forced everyone else to stop, to listen, and to look past the surface of things to the complex, often painful, truth that lies beneath. The days that followed were transformative. The Thorn Farm, once a place of impending tragedy, became a center of quiet pilgrimage. Marcus, humbled and changed, tore down the oppressive holding pen. The first thing he did was offer Kai a job, a room in his house, anything the boy wanted. He saw in Kai not just the savior of his bull, but the keeper of a wisdom his own pragmatic world had lost. Kai, in turn, found himself in an unfamiliar position. He was no longer invisible. People in town would nod to him, their eyes holding a new respect. He was no longer the boy on the fringes. But his heart remained with the quiet language of the world, not the loud praise of people. He accepted Marcus's offer, not for a room or for money, but for the one thing he truly wanted, to be near Goliath. The fence, that potent symbol of division, began to change its meaning. Marcus, guided by Kai's quiet intuition, decided to build something new. He repurposed the wood from the old grim pen and built a wide, welcoming fence around a lush new pasture, a place not of confinement, but of sanctuary. It was an open secret that Kai was the true master of this new space. He spent his days there with Goliath, who was now healing in body and spirit. The bull, who had once flinched at every human approach, now followed Kai with the docile devotion of a puppy. The bond between them was a silent, powerful testament to their shared story. Soon, Marcus, at Kai's gentle urging, opened the gate. He invited the town's children to come, not to stare at a spectacle, but to learn. Kai, the boy who once barely spoke, became a teacher. He didn't use many words. Instead, he taught by example. He showed them how to be still. He showed them how to listen with more than their ears. He taught them to see the animal first, not the story they'd been told about it. The fence that had once been a barrier between wealth and poverty, between fear and understanding, had become a bridge. It enclosed a space where a new kind of community was being forged, one based on empathy. As the sun would set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Kai would often sit with his back against Goliath's warm, solid flank. The great bull would rest his head nearby, breathing slowly and deeply, a picture of absolute peace. The sunset no longer felt mournful. It was a promise. It was the closing of a painful chapter and the beautiful, quiet beginning of another. Kai had found his voice not in shouting, but in whispering. He had found his place not by forcing his way in, but by quietly and bravely standing for a truth no one else could see. The outcast had become the heart of his community. The story of Kai and Goliath became a quiet legend, an echo that resonated far beyond the valley. It wasn't a tale of a single dramatic event, but of a lasting, fundamental shift. It became a modern parable, whispered from one person to another, a reminder that the loudest roar often hides the deepest pain. The echo of that morning changed everyone it touched. Dr. Eris integrated what he learned into his practice. He became known for his patience, for taking the extra time to observe an animal's behavior, for listening to the instincts of owners, and for always looking for the hidden pain behind the frightening symptom. He spoke often of the Goliath principle. Before you condemn, you must connect. Marcus Thorne was a man reborn. The hard, pragmatic shell had been shattered, revealing a kinder, more thoughtful core. He ran his farm differently, with a new respect for the complex emotional lives of the animals in his care. He became a local advocate for compassionate farming, his own story serving as his most powerful credential. His relationship with Kai deepened into one of father and son, a bond forged in shared remorse and redemption. The farm was no longer just a business, it was a sanctuary, a living classroom where the primary lesson was empathy, but the most profound echo was in the enduring bond between the boy and the bull. Years passed. Kai grew into a young man, his quiet nature now seen not as a weakness, but as a profound strength. Goliath grew old, his massive frame carrying the grace of a survivor. They were an inseparable pair, a constant, living symbol of the story that had reshaped their world. They would often be found in the pasture at dusk, sitting together in the fading light, a picture of perfect, interspecies harmony. The whisper had not been a one-time miracle. It was the beginning of a lifelong conversation, a dialogue of trust and understanding that needed no words. It was an echo of a single, gentle act that proved that true strength isn't found in the power to condemn, but in the courage to connect, to listen, and to offer comfort in the face of fear. It was a reminder, as beautiful and enduring as the setting sun, that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is a quiet voice saying, "I see you."